It's okay. I'm here.
A quick reminder before we start. Smash that subscribe button and turn on those notifications so you're always in the loop. What is up, drama lovers? Today, we're unpacking the epic storyline and complete recap of Blitzed by My Rival's Obsession. This story is packed with unpredictable twists, intense rivals to lovers energy, and unforgettable moments that will keep you hooked until the very end. Let's not wait any longer, let's roll the recap.
The stadium lights blazed down on the green turf below. The roar of the massive crowd was a physical force. It vibrated through the ground. Seth Wynn adjusted his helmet with sweaty hands. He was the captain of the White Lions. He was the #1 NFL draft pick this season. Tonight was the ultimate test. Only 15 seconds remained on the heavy stadium clock. He had to lead his team to victory tonight. His breathing was heavy but strictly controlled. He scanned the aggressive defensive line of the Black Beats. His eyes locked on one specific man. Matthew Anderson stood there, ready to strike. He was the celebrated rookie of the season. No one had successfully broken through Matthew's defense yet. Word on the street was very clear about Matthew. The rookie had been studying Seth's strategy all season long. Matthew called Seth his only real rival. The thought made Seth grit his teeth hard. He gripped the textured leather of the football tighter. The tension in the cold air was incredibly thick. The referee blew the sharp silver whistle. The final play of the game instantly began. Seth dropped back quickly to pass the ball. He searched desperately for a clear opening. The defensive line clashed with a violent crunch of pads. Matthew broke through the protective line easily. He charged straight at Seth like a freight train. "Gotcha!" Matthew yelled over the deafening crowd noise. Seth refused to panic in the pocket. He waited for the perfect fraction of a second. He threw the ball deep down the grassy field. "Catch it!" Seth shouted with all his remaining might. The wide receiver leaped high into the air. He caught the spiraling ball perfectly in stride. He crossed the white line right into the end zone. "Touchdown!" The energetic announcer's voice boomed over the speakers. The White Lions officially took the game. It was a spectacular finish. The stadium erupted into absolute madness and cheering. Seth exhaled a long, exhausted breath. He felt a brief, sweet moment of pure triumph. But the dark shadow of his father always loomed over him. "I won, Dad," Seth thought silently to himself. "You have got to be proud this time." Seth walked slowly toward the bustling sidelines. Matthew approached him from the opposing side. The rookie had a cocky, arrogant grin on his face. "How does it feel to be on top, Captain?" Matthew asked. His tone was deeply mocking and provocative. Seth glared at him with intense hatred. "You want to die?" Seth snapped back aggressively. He reached out and grabbed Matthew firmly by the collar. He pushed the rookie back a step. "Hey, if choking out your opponents is how you want to celebrate, go right ahead." Matthew laughed darkly. Seth shoved him away roughly in disgust. "You bastard," Seth muttered under his breath. He turned and walked away from the irritating rookie. He needed to get to the locker room immediately. "Call it a gift from me to you, champ," Matthew called out after him. Two other teammates watched the heated exchange from afar. "Hey, look at Seth and Matthew," one teammate pointed out. "They have been standing there for a minute now. Are they like close or something?" "Nah, you are seeing things," the second teammate replied quickly. "They absolutely hate each other." It was the undeniable truth for everyone to see. Inside the locker room, the atmosphere was completely electric. "Cap, that finish was insane," a teammate cheered loudly as Seth walked in. "Matthew might be the hot new thing, but you are still on top." The teammate slapped Seth on the shoulder. Seth nodded, accepting the high praise. "Nah, wrong." A deep voice suddenly interrupted the celebration. Everyone turned to look at the doorway. It was Matthew standing there confidently. He stood in the doorway of the White Lions sanctuary. He wore a very confident, knowing smirk. "I will be the one on top soon enough," Matthew declared. The noisy locker room fell totally silent. "Yo, Matthew, welcome to the team," another player said. He tried to break the awkward silence in the room. "The White Lions have been looking for a player like you to join up," the player continued happily. Seth froze completely in his tracks. Isn't that the Black Bears linebacker? Someone whispered loudly. The guy is almost as popular as our captain nowadays. What is he doing here? Don't tell me he transferred just for the captain, right? Another muttered in disbelief. Seth angrily marched right up to Matthew's face. Seth, so we meet again, Matthew said incredibly smoothly. What the hell are you doing here? Seth demanded. His voice was low and very dangerous. Matthew stepped even closer into Seth's personal space. Because I want to come out on top of you, Captain, he whispered for only Seth to hear. Seth completely lost his temper at the insult. Asshole, go to hell, he yelled at the top of his lungs. He aggressively threw a hard punch. The locker room instantly erupted in massive chaos. Players rushed in quickly to pull the two fighting men apart. It was a complete disaster. Seth, knock it off, someone shouted over the noise. Why are you throwing hands at Matthew? Matthew just wiped his split lip and smiled widely. That is just Seth's welcome gift to me, Matthew said calmly to the shocked room. Unconventional, but I definitely like it, he added slyly. Suddenly, the head coach walked into the room. The chaotic space instantly grew dead quiet. Seth, the coach barked. His face was red with fury. You have always been a responsible captain, the angry coach scolded. What the hell are you doing going after a new teammate on his first day? Seth looked down at the floor, deeply embarrassed. Coach, I am sorry, Seth mumbled quietly. I simply lost my temper out there. He reluctantly turned to face the smug rookie. Sorry, Matthew. Seth forced the words out of his mouth. Matthew smiled widely like a predator. So well behaved, Matthew mocked very quietly. Good boy. The coach crossed his thick arms over his chest and glared at both of them. We are exactly 1 month away from the NAC regular season, he announced firmly. You two are the absolute backbone of this football team, so you need to get on the same page fast, the coach demanded. Starting today, you are sharing a room. Got it. Seth's head snapped up quickly. What? Seth asked in total disbelief. Matthew looked equally surprised by the sudden news. What? He echoed the captain's shock. Hold on, you want me to room with him? Seth argued loudly. No way, coach. I refuse. The coach shook his head stubbornly at the protest. It is not up for debate. It is the school's decision, not mine, the coach explained coldly. Let this be a harsh lesson, Seth and Matthew. Do not forget the conditions you originally agreed to. Matthew quickly recovered his cool composure. No worries, coach, Matthew said smoothly. The angry coach turned around and promptly left the room. Seth glared fiercely at Matthew. Looks like we are roommates now, Seth, Matthew said. Seth scoffed loudly in pure frustration. Fine, I will go along with it, he replied very bitterly. But you better watch yourself, Matthew smirked again, clearly enjoying the rise he got out of Seth. Of course, he replied playfully. See you back in bed. Seth's handsome face flushed bright red with sudden anger. Perv, Seth muttered under his breath. Psycho, he grabbed his bag and stormed off. Matthew watched Seth walk away in a huff. A dark, determined look crossed his handsome face. Now that I am here, Seth, Matthew said to himself, I am not about to let you off easy. The fierce rivalry was just truly beginning. Later that evening, Seth stood entirely alone in the hallway. He was on a tense phone call with his strict father. Ted Winward was a legendary former NFL star quarterback. His high expectations were suffocating. Your coach tells me you got into a fight, Ted's deep voice boomed through the phone. With that new transfer, Matthew, what is wrong with you? Seth visibly flinched at the harsh tone. That is because he started to explain himself defensively, but his father would not let him speak. Did you forget you almost lost to him last time? Ted interrupted sharply. When the NFL draft comes around, I want your name firmly on top. No question. No competition, Ted demanded fiercely. You are the son of former NFL star quarterback Ted Winward. Akami, you do not get to drag my name through the dirt, his father continued mercilessly. Seth squeezed his eyes shut to stop the tears. I know, Dad, Seth said very softly into the receiver. I promise I will not let you down. He slowly hung up the glowing phone. His strong hands were shaking slightly from the immense stress. He took a deep breath to steady his racing heart. I can definitely do this. I will not lose to him this time, Seth whispered bravely to the empty hallway. He headed straight to the communal locker room showers. He desperately needed to wash away the heavy stress of the long day. The hot, steaming water felt incredibly good against his sore muscles. Suddenly, he heard a distinct noise over the running water. Someone else is here, Seth thought with a jolt of panic. He peeked out carefully. He looked from behind the thin shower curtain. It was Matthew standing right there. "Damn, Captain," Matthew said with a wicked gleam in his eye. "You miss me that much?" Matthew teased shamelessly. Seth gasped loudly in genuine shock. "What do you want?" he demanded angrily. Matthew stepped much closer to the running water. "Who knew our goody-two-shoes had such a filthy side?" Matthew purred softly. "Color me absolutely impressed." "Move," Matthew commanded softly. "Hey, you cannot just take care of yourself and leave me hanging," Matthew taunted. He backed a very wet Seth against the cold tiles. "Aren't you going to take responsibility?" Seth panicked as he felt the close proximity. "He is hard," Seth realized with sudden, absolute horror. "Let go of me, you weirdo," Seth yelled loudly. He tried his best to push Matthew away. "Help me out, Captain," Matthew demanded, his voice dropping low and husky. "Not a chance." Seth rigidly refused the inappropriate request. Matthew aggressively grabbed Seth's wet wrist. "If you do not, I will tell the media," Matthew threatened darkly. Seth froze in pure terror. "I will tell them that the White Lion star quarterback moans his teammate's name while in the shower," Matthew finished his terrible threat. Seth stared at him in utter disbelief. "Do not you dare," Seth hissed through gritted teeth. "They would have a field day with that kind of story. Is this just a sick game to you?" Seth asked, his voice shaking with pure anger. "That is absolutely disgusting." Matthew just smiled calmly. "Easy, Cap. Taking care of your teammates is part of the job, isn't it?" Matthew pressed his body even closer. Seth was completely trapped now. He had no viable way out of this situation. The direct threat to his public reputation was far too great. His father would surely kill him. He slowly surrendered to the cruel blackmail. "Fine," Seth whispered, looking away in deep shame. "I will help you out." The heavy steam in the shower room grew even thicker. Seth felt totally humiliated and utterly defeated. He had fallen right into Matthew's trap. Afterward, Seth sat completely alone in his dark dorm room. He felt physically sick to his stomach. "I was so incredibly careless," he thought. "Matthew walked in on me, and then I ended up doing that." He buried his flushed face deep in his shaking hands. He felt entirely ashamed of himself. "I will keep my distance from this asshole from now on," he promised himself firmly. But he deeply knew it would be impossible since they lived together. Night finally fell over the quiet college campus. The shared dorm room was dark and completely silent. Seth was fast asleep in his narrow bed, but his troubled mind was not at peace at all. A terrible, vivid nightmare gripped his subconscious tightly. "Dad," Seth mumbled in his sleep. "Dad." The dark dream shifted violently. He suddenly saw his father's incredibly angry face. Ted Winward looked down at him with sheer disappointment. "You lost to Matthew again," Ted spat angrily in the vivid dream. Seth tossed and turned restlessly in his bed. Cold sweat formed on his forehead. "How did I end up with such a pathetic son?" his father asked cruelly. "I wasn't focused, Dad." Dream Seth pleaded desperately for forgiveness. "I promise I will get it right next time," Seth begged softly. But his angry father turned his back. "There is no next time," Ted said coldly. "My family has no use for a son who cannot be a true champion. Get out," his father commanded sharply. Panic totally seized Seth's tight chest. "Dad," he cried out loudly in his restless sleep. "Dad, do not leave me." He gasped for clean air, trapped in the terrifying vision. Suddenly, a warm hand gently touched his trembling shoulder. "Relax, it is just a bad dream," a deep voice said softly in the dark. Seth slowly opened his tired, tear-filled eyes. He was completely disoriented and terrified. His body was trembling violently from the nightmare. "It is so cold," Seth shivered uncontrollably. "Everything hurts so much." Cold. He curled tightly into a small ball under his heavy blankets. The tall figure beside his bed leaned down closer. It was Matthew. His usual arrogant smirk was completely gone from his handsome face. "It is okay, I am right here," Matthew whispered very gently. He placed a cool hand on Seth's forehead. He frowned deeply with genuine concern. "He is burning up," Matthew realized with a start. "Does he have a high fever?" Matthew quickly got up and went to work helping his rival. He fetched a damp cloth and gently wiped Seth's sweaty face. The tough, aggressive captain looked incredibly fragile right now. "Seth," Matthew said softly, "you soaked through all your bed sheets. You are going to have to sleep in my bed tonight." Matthew carefully helped the weak quarterback sit up. Seth leaned very heavily against his strong rival, far too weak to protest the move. "Dad, do not leave me alone," Seth whimpered softly in his feverish delirium. Matthew gently laid Seth down on his own dry, warm bed. He pulled the thick covers securely up over the sick captain. Matthew sat quietly beside him, closely watching him sleep peacefully. "Such a tough guy when he is fully awake," Matthew murmured softly to himself, "but he cries out for his dad when he is sick and vulnerable." Matthew gently stroked Seth's damp hair away from his forehead. A very strange look of genuine affection crossed Matthew's face. He leaned in much closer to the sleeping captain. "Do not be scared anymore," Matthew promised in a very quiet whisper. "You still have me right here. I am yours." The bitter tension and fierce rivalry melted away in the dark room. Matthew was simply his protector. The severe fever finally broke just before dawn. Warm sunlight streamed brightly through the dorm room window. Seth slowly opened his heavy eyes. He felt incredibly groggy and deeply confused. He stared blankly at the white ceiling above him. "I will make it to the finals next time," he thought. "I will bulldoze right through anyone who tries to stop me." His mind suddenly flashed back to the wildly cheering crowds of his glorious past. "Let us congratulate Seth on leading his team to another massive victory," an announcer's loud voice magically echoed in his foggy memory. Seth blinked several times to clear his cloudy vision. He carefully shifted his body weight on the mattress. His tired body felt extremely heavy. He turned his head to the side. He saw Matthew sleeping very peacefully right next to him. Seth froze entirely. Panic rushed rapidly through his veins. "Matthew," he gasped in pure shock. "You absolute bastard. What was that for?" Seth sat up very quickly, his heart pounding wildly in his chest. He aggressively grabbed a soft pillow and threw it hard at Matthew. "Why the hell are you in my bed?" Seth yelled at the top of his lungs. Matthew groaned loudly and opened one sleepy eye. He looked entirely unfazed by the sudden outburst. "Bro, this is actually my bed," Matthew stated. Seth rapidly looked around the small room. He realized with horror that Matthew was completely right. He was indeed sitting in Matthew's bed. Massive confusion quickly washed over his tired brain. How on earth did he get over here? "You sleepwalked over here in the middle of the night," Matthew lied incredibly smoothly to the captain. He sat up slowly, the thin white sheet falling dangerously to his waist. "And you crawled right into my bed all by yourself," Matthew added with a smirk. Seth furiously shook his head in absolute denial of the event. "How is that even logically possible?" Seth demanded loudly. His handsome face flushed bright red with embarrassment. "I absolutely do not sleepwalk." He scrambled out of the warm bed very quickly. Matthew just leaned back comfortably on his elbows. A truly wicked smile was rapidly forming on his face. "You kept me up all night long," Matthew teased mercilessly. His dark eyes slowly trailed up and down Seth's rigid, tense body. "Aren't you going to make it up to me?" Matthew asked smoothly. Seth stood totally frozen in the very middle of the dorm room. He felt utterly trapped. "What exactly do you want?" Seth asked very cautiously. Matthew's smile instantly widened into a highly predatory, dangerous grin. "Heat," Matthew murmured softly. The single, loaded word hung very heavily in the quiet air between them. The intense game was far from over. Seth stared at the smirking rookie in pure disbelief. The single word Matthew had spoken echoed loudly in his mind. Heat. What exactly did he mean by that dangerous request? Seth felt his heart hammering against his tight ribs. "You are totally out of your mind," Seth finally replied. He took a very cautious step backward toward the wooden door. He needed to escape this suffocating room immediately. The air felt far too thick for him to breathe properly. Matthew merely chuckled darkly from the messy bed. He stretched his strong arms high above his head. His well-defined muscles flexed smoothly under his pale skin. He clearly enjoyed watching his proud captain squirm in pure panic. "Running away so soon, Captain," Matthew teased softly. His deep voice rumbled pleasantly across the small space. "We have a very long season ahead of us together. You cannot avoid me forever in this tiny shared college room." Seth grabbed his duffel bag tightly with shaking hands. He refused to give Matthew the satisfaction of a verbal response. He quickly turned the cold brass doorknob. He practically ran out into the empty, quiet dormitory hallway. He leaned heavily against the cold cinder block wall. His legs felt incredibly weak like wet noodles. The severe fever had drained all of his physical strength, but the intense mental exhaustion was entirely due to Matthew Anderson. The bright morning sun baked the green artificial turf. The White Lions were running extremely grueling offensive drills. Coach blew his silver whistle sharply from the busy sidelines. The loud, shrill sound pierced the humid air. "Hustle up, ladies," Coach yelled loudly at the exhausted team. "We have exactly 3 weeks until the NAC regular season opener. We need total perfection on this field." Seth stood near the 50-yard line panting heavily. His entire body still ached terribly from his recent severe fever, but he absolutely refused to show any visible weakness. His demanding father would never accept an excuse like a simple cold. Ted Winward demanded absolute victory. Seth bent over and placed his sweaty hands on his knees. He took several deep, ragged breaths to steady himself. Suddenly, a large shadow fell directly over him. He instantly recognized the familiar scent of expensive cologne. It was Matthew. The arrogant rookie wore his black practice jersey. He looked completely fresh and barely out of breath. "You look like absolute garbage today, Captain," Matthew said smoothly. His dark eyes analyzed Seth closely. Seth stood up completely straight and glared at his rival. "Mind your own damn business, rookie," Seth snapped angrily. He wiped the salty sweat from his brow. "I am perfectly fine to run the next offensive passing play today," Matthew scoffed loudly and crossed his thick arms. "Your throwing arm is shaking visibly right now," Matthew pointed out accurately. "If you push yourself too hard, you will end up back in my bed." "I will not complain though." Seth felt a hot flush of pure anger rise to his cheeks. The vivid memory of waking up in Matthew's bed haunted him deeply. "Shut your mouth right now," Seth hissed quietly. He glanced around to see if anyone was listening closely. Thankfully, the rest of the football team was busy running laps. "Do not ever mention that terrible morning again," Seth threatened softly. "I only slept there because I was severely sick and completely out of my right mind." Matthew stepped dangerously close to the angry captain. "Are you entirely sure about that, Seth?" Matthew whispered seductively. "You seemed perfectly comfortable wrapped up tightly in my warm sheets. You even begged me to stay." Seth wanted to punch that arrogant smirk right off his face, but Coach suddenly blew his shrill whistle again. "Seth, Matthew, get your lazy asses on the scrimmage line right now," Coach commanded loudly from the far sideline. The two bitter rivals instantly snapped to full attention. They quickly jogged over to their respective starting positions. Seth lined up directly behind the heavy center. Matthew stood directly across from him on the defense line. Their intense eyes locked fiercely across the short distance. The air between them crackled with highly dangerous electricity. Seth shouted the complex play call loudly to his offensive team. "Blue 42! Blue 42! Hut!" The large center snapped the brown football directly into Seth's hands. Seth dropped back quickly into the protective pocket. He frantically scanned the wide field for an open receiver, but the defensive line was incredibly strong. Matthew burst violently through the protective offensive wall. He bypassed the large blockers with terrifying speed and agility. He had a completely clear, open path right to the vulnerable quarterback. Seth panicked internally. Seth tried his best to scramble out of the dangerous pocket, but Matthew was simply far too fast for him to escape. The strong rookie launched his heavy body directly at Seth. They crashed violently onto the hard turf together. The heavy impact knocked the wind entirely out of Seth's lungs. The precious football popped loose and tumbled away freely. The loud whistle blew to firmly signal a dead ball play. Matthew rested his heavy weight entirely on Seth. "Sacked again, Captain," Matthew whispered directly into Seth's ear. His hot breath sent involuntary shivers down Seth's spine. Matthew refused to get up from the ground immediately. He pinned Seth firmly to the synthetic grass. "Get off me, you heavy brute!" Seth gasped for clean air. He struggled fiercely against the rookie's iron grip, but Matthew just held him down effortlessly. "You are losing your touch, Seth," Matthew taunted him very cruelly. Coach jogged over angrily to the pile of tangled players. "What exactly is wrong with you today, Seth?" Coach demanded loudly. "You are completely distracted out here on the field. Get your head firmly in the game immediately." Seth finally pushed Matthew off his sore, aching body. He stood up slowly and dusted off his dirty practice pants. Humiliation burned brightly in his tight chest. He refused to look directly at the deeply disappointed head coach. "I am deeply sorry, Coach," Seth mumbled quietly to the turf. "It will not happen again. I swear it." The strict coach shook his head in total frustration. It better not happen again, son. The draft scouts are watching closely. The mention of the draft scouts made Seth's stomach drop completely. His angry father would absolutely destroy him if he failed to impress them. Ted Winward demanded absolute perfection from his only son. Failure meant exile forever. Practice finally ended after 2 more grueling, painful hours. Seth trudged slowly back to the quiet locker room alone. He felt completely defeated and physically broken. He just wanted to disappear completely from the entire world. He opened his metal locker and stared blankly at his gear. He slowly peeled off his sweaty, smelly practice jersey. He heard the heavy door open behind him. He did not even need to turn around to know exactly who it was entering. "You played like utter garbage today," Matthew stated flatly. The rookie leaned casually against the cold metal lockers. He watched Seth undress with dark, predatory eyes. Seth ignored the harsh insult and continued removing pads. "I do not want to hear it right now, Matthew," Seth replied tiredly. "Just leave me alone for 5 minutes. Please." The rare sound of pure defeat in Seth's voice surprised the rookie. Matthew frowned slightly in genuine concern. He slowly pushed himself off the cold metal locker bank. He walked very quietly over to the exhausted captain. "Your father called the coach today," Matthew revealed softly. Seth froze entirely, his hands gripping his bag tightly. Seth slowly turned his head to look directly at Matthew. Total panic was clearly evident in his wide, beautiful eyes. "What did he say to the coach?" Seth asked. His voice trembled violently with pure, unadulterated fear. "He said if you do not perform perfectly in the opening game, he will pull you from the team entirely," Matthew explained quietly. "He threatened to force you to transfer to a completely different school immediately. Out of state." The heavy words felt like a physical blow to Seth's chest. He staggered backward and hit his metal locker loudly. He slid slowly down the cold metal until he hit the floor. He pulled his knees tightly to his heaving chest. He could not breathe properly at all. The immense pressure was finally crushing his spirit completely. He buried his face deep in his strong hands. A single, hot tear escaped his tight eye and rolled quickly down his cheek. Matthew watched the total breakdown in absolute silence. The arrogant smirk was completely gone from his handsome face. He slowly lowered his large frame to the tiled floor. He sat down quietly right next to his broken, sad rival. They sat together in the empty locker room for a long time. The only sound was Seth's quiet, ragged breathing. Matthew did not offer any mocking words or cruel insults. He simply sat perfectly still beside the crying captain. "Why do you even care?" Seth finally choked out quietly. He wiped his wet eyes aggressively with his bare arm. "You want my spot on the team. You want to ruin my entire life. Why are you telling me this secret information now?" Matthew looked straight ahead at the row of gray lockers. "I do want to beat you," Matthew admitted completely honestly. "I want to be the best player on this entire field. But I want to beat you when you are at your absolute best." He slowly turned his head to look deeply at Seth. "There is absolutely no honor in breaking a man who is already shattered," Matthew said softly. "Your father is a cruel monster. He is completely destroying your immense talent." Seth stared at the rookie in pure, absolute shock. No one had ever dared to speak ill of the great Ted Winward before. Everyone worshipped his famous father. But Matthew saw right through the shiny, fake golden facade easily. "You do not know him at all," Seth defended weakly. But his fragile voice lacked any real, true conviction. Matthew sighed softly and reached out a strong hand. He gently rested it on Seth's bare, shaking right shoulder carefully. "I know enough to see that he is ruining you from the inside out," Matthew stated firmly. The warm touch on his shoulder sent a jolt through Seth's body. He did not push the comforting hand away this time. He just leaned into it. The silence in the locker room was thick and heavy. Seth slowly looked up, his eyes searching Matthew's face. He saw no judgment, only a strange, intense focus. He felt a sudden, inexplicable sense of trust building. "If I lose this position, I lose everything," Seth whispered softly. The reality of his situation was a crushing, physical weight. "My father will ensure I never play football again. He will bury my reputation forever." Matthew leaned closer, his voice dropping to a low, serious tone. "We can change that, Seth," he stated firmly. "We have 3 weeks until the season opener. I can help you train. I know your blind spots better than anyone." Seth laughed, a hollow, bitter sound in the quiet room. "You want to train me? You are my greatest rival. Why would you ever help me improve?" He looked at Matthew, waiting for the inevitable, cruel, and selfish punchline. Matthew didn't smile. He held Seth's gaze with unnerving intensity. Because if you are at your best, and I still beat you, then my victory will be absolute, Matthew explained. I want the best version of you, not this broken mess. The logic was cold, but it was honest. Seth slowly nodded his head. He was desperate, and he was terrified. He had no other allies in this world. What are the terms? He asked. His voice sounded surprisingly steady now. Total cooperation, Matthew replied immediately. We practice together alone every single night. No ego, no fighting, no politics. You listen to every single thing I say. We become a unit on the field, or we both fail completely. The stadium was dark and silent under the pale moonlight. The grass was cool and damp under their cleats. Seth and Matthew stood at the 50-yard line, ready for their first unofficial, secret, and highly intense training session. Again, Matthew barked from the defensive line. Your footwork is sloppy, Seth. You are telegraphing your throws before you even move. A good linebacker will see that and punish you. You need to be faster and more precise. Seth wiped his face and nodded. He was exhausted, but he felt a strange sense of clarity he hadn't felt in years. He lined up again. Hut! He shouted into the dark, empty air. He snapped the ball back and dropped into his set. He pivoted, faked a handoff, and rolled out to the right. He saw the path Matthew had drawn for him in the dirt earlier. He fired a perfect, tight spiral toward the end zone. The ball cut through the air with zero hesitation. Matthew didn't move to stop him. He watched the ball sail over his head with a look of approval. Better, he called out. Now, do it again, but do it while I am actually coming for you. Don't let me rattle your composure. They repeated the play dozens of times. Every time Seth failed, Matthew forced him to do push-ups. Every time Matthew succeeded, he made Seth restart the entire sequence. It was grueling, but it was the most productive training he had. As the night deepened, the tension shifted. It was no longer just about football. It was about the strange, magnetic pull between them. They were sweating, panting, and constantly touching as they corrected each other's form and posture. By the second week, their dynamic had shifted into something else entirely. They were constantly together, on and off the field. The rest of the team started to notice, whispering and wondering why the two rivals were suddenly inseparable. One night, after a particularly brutal session, they were sitting on the cold turf. Seth was gasping for air, his chest heaving. He was covered in dirt, and his jersey was torn. Matthew was sitting right beside him, equally exhausted. You're actually getting better, Matthew noted. His voice was softer, less mocking than usual. He reached out and brushed a smudge of dirt off Seth's cheek. The touch lingered for a second too long. Seth didn't pull away this time. I just want to survive this season, Seth admitted. He looked at Matthew. The moonlight caught the sharp, handsome angles of the rookie's face. He realized, with a jolt of panic, that he found Matthew incredibly attractive, not just a rival. You will do more than survive, Matthew whispered. He shifted his weight, his knee brushing against Seth's leg. The contact was deliberate, and the air between them grew heavy again. You will be the best in the league, Seth. Seth turned his head. They were mere inches apart. He could see the dark intensity in Matthew's eyes. It was a look that promised both war and intimacy. Why are you doing this, really? Seth asked, his voice barely a whisper now. Matthew didn't answer with words. He slowly leaned in, testing the distance. Seth's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He knew he should move, but he was frozen. He wanted to see how far this would really go tonight. The air felt electrified. Seth's pulse was visible in his neck. He saw Matthew's eyes drop to his lips, then back to his eyes. It was a silent, dangerous invitation. The line between rivalry and obsession was rapidly disappearing entirely. If we do this, Seth whispered, his breath hitting Matthew's lips, there is no going back to how it was before. We are enemies on the field, remember? He was trying to hold on to the last shred of their professional rivalry. Matthew smiled a slow, genuine, and deeply possessive smile that had nothing to do with football. I think we both know that we stopped being just rivals a long time ago, he replied. We are already deep in the game, Captain. Matthew closed the final inch of space between them. When their lips met, it was like a sudden, violent explosion of everything they had been suppressing. It wasn't gentle. It was desperate, frantic, and filled with months of tension. Seth grabbed Matthew's shoulders, pulling him in closer, as if he could merge their bodies to escape the pressure of their reality. Matthew groaned into his mouth, his hands tangling in Seth's damp hair. They were both losing control. They fell back onto the cool grass, the world around them fading into darkness. The stadium, the draft, his father, everything stopped mattering. There was only the heat of their skin and the sound of their ragged, desperate breathing. They kissed until they were breathless, their bodies pressed together in a tangle of limbs and uniforms. For the first time in his life, Seth didn't feel like a son or a captain. He just felt alive. And for now, that was enough. The sun began to peek over the stadium bleachers. The cold morning air brought them back to reality. Seth sat up, his hair messy and his uniform completely ruined. He looked at Matthew, who was already watching him with a calm, steady gaze. The events of the night hit Seth like a train. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. "What have we done?" Seth whispered. His voice was laced with sudden, sharp panic. He thought of the consequences if anyone found out. Matthew reached out and grabbed his hand firmly. "We did what we needed to do," he said. His voice was firm. "You're not that fragile, terrified boy anymore, Seth. You're standing on your own 2 feet, even if you are with me." Seth pulled his hand away quickly, standing up. "My father will kill me if he hears a rumor about this. You don't know him. He doesn't just want me to be a champion. He wants me to be perfect. Perfect people don't do this." "Maybe your father is the one who's broken," Matthew replied, rising to his feet. He didn't look bothered by the danger. "You're playing better than you have all year because you're finally angry, not just scared. Embrace the chaos, Seth." They returned to the locker room separately, as they usually did. But the atmosphere had shifted. Seth felt like a different person. He walked with more confidence, his chin held high. He wasn't afraid of the other players anymore. However, the scrutiny remained. As he walked to his locker, he saw a group of teammates huddled near the corner, whispering. They fell silent as soon as they saw him. The tension in the room was thicker than it had ever been. "Hey, Cap," a linebacker called out, stepping into his path. "We heard you and the rookie have been spending a lot of late nights on the field. You trying to turn him into your personal pet or something?" The jab was meant to be mean. Seth didn't flinch. He looked the man in the eye and smiled coldly. "I'm making sure he doesn't embarrass this team when the season starts," he replied smoothly. "You should worry less about my habits and more about your own stats." The teammate backed down, surprised by the sharp retort. Seth walked to his locker, his heart hammering. He realized that the rumors were already starting. He had to be careful. He couldn't let his private life sabotage his professional career. Later that afternoon, his phone buzzed violently in his pocket. He saw the name on the screen, Dad. Seth felt his blood run cold. He stepped into a private bathroom stall and locked the door before answering the incoming call. "Seth," his father's voice boomed. It was colder than ice. "I've been hearing reports. People are saying you've been seen constantly with that rookie, Matthew Anderson. Explain to me why my son is playing house with his competition." Seth gripped the edge of the sink, his knuckles white. "We're training, Dad. That's all. I'm taking the competition seriously. I'm preparing to win the opener. Isn't that what you wanted?" He tried to keep his voice steady and calm. "I wanted a winner, not a socialite," his father spat. "If I find out you're distracted by anything or anyone that doesn't serve the goal of winning that championship, I will end your career before the season even hits its peak. Do you hear me?" "I hear you," Seth said. His voice was hollow. "I will be ready for the opener. You won't be disappointed." He hung up, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped the phone. The pressure was becoming truly unbearable. Seth walked out of the bathroom and found Matthew waiting at the end of the hallway. He looked at Seth's pale face and immediately knew what had happened. He didn't need to ask. He just started walking beside him toward the exit. "He threatened you again," Matthew stated. It wasn't a question. They stepped out into the bright, warm afternoon sun. The campus was busy with students going to class, oblivious to the drama unfolding in the football team's locker room. "He's going to ruin me, Matthew," Seth said. He felt a sudden, desperate urge to cry. "I've spent my entire life trying to be the man he wants me to be. And the second I deviate, he threatens to destroy everything I've worked for." Matthew stopped walking and turned to face him. He didn't care who was watching. He grabbed Seth by the shoulders and looked him deep in the eyes. "Then let him try," Matthew whispered. "He can't take your talent away from you. He can take the team," Seth argued. "He has connections. He could have me pulled, benched, or transferred." He felt like he was drowning in the weight of his father's expectations. He was so tired of fighting this war alone. Matthew pulled him into a quiet alcove between two campus buildings. "You're not alone in this," he said, his voice unusually gentle. "I told you, I'm yours. If your father wants to play dirty, we'll play dirty too. We'll be unstoppable." Seth looked at him, searching for the lie. He found none. He realized that this rivalry had evolved into a bond that was stronger than any career ambition. They were in this mess together, and for the first time, that felt okay. "We have to win that game," Seth said, his voice firming up. "Not just for the scouts. Not for my father. We win it to prove that we don't need their permission to be who we are." He felt a fire burning in his chest that wasn't fear. Matthew smiled. It was the smile of a man who had already won the most important prize. "Then let's go back to the field," he said. "We have a lot of work to do if we're going to dismantle the league's best defense in 3 weeks. They walked back toward the stadium. They were not just rivals anymore. They were partners in a high-stakes, dangerous game of football and desire. And as they stepped onto the turf, they were finally ready to face the world together. The NAC regular season opener was now only 24 hours away. The entire campus was buzzing with an intense, frantic energy. Huge banners of the White Lions hung from the library walls. The pressure was finally reaching a breaking point for everyone involved. Seth spent the entire day in the film room. He studied the tapes of their upcoming opponent until his eyes burned. He felt calm, but it was a cold, detached calm. He had stopped caring about the media, the fans, and even his father's constant, looming threats. He only cared about the plan he and Matthew had perfected. They had spent every single night on that field, refining their timing and their connection. It was a secret language that only they understood. It was a silent, powerful bond that had transformed them. Matthew walked into the film room, carrying 2 cold energy drinks. He set one down in front of Seth without saying a word. He sat in the chair next to him, his shoulder pressing firmly against Seth's. The familiar contact grounded him instantly. "The team is nervous," Matthew said softly. "They're worried about the defense. They think we haven't found a rhythm yet." He glanced at Seth, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. "They have no idea what we're going to unleash tomorrow." They held one final private walkthrough under the stadium lights. The air was crisp and smelled like damp earth. They ran through the primary playbooks, but it felt different this time. There was no more tension, only a seamless, fluid motion between them. Seth snapped the ball, pivoted, and threw a pass that hit Matthew exactly where he needed to be before he even turned around. It was perfect. They repeated it, and it was perfect every single time. They were finally in complete, total sync with each other. "You're ready," Matthew said, catching the ball and holding it tight. "You're more than ready. You're the best quarterback in this league, Seth. Don't let anyone tell you differently tomorrow. Not the scouts, and especially not that old man of yours." Seth looked at him, feeling a sudden surge of gratitude. "I couldn't have done this without you," he confessed. It was the most honest thing he had ever said to another person. The rivalry had died, and in its place, something much more powerful had emerged. Matthew stepped closer, closing the gap between them. He reached out and brushed a lock of hair from Seth's forehead. "Just win," Matthew whispered. "I'll be right there with you. I'm not going anywhere, no matter what happens once that clock hits 0. They returned to their shared dorm room for the final time before the big game. The room felt smaller, more intimate than ever. Seth sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his gear. His cleats, his pads, and his jersey were all laid out in perfect order. He felt a strange, quiet peace. He had done everything he could. He had trained until he was broken, and he had learned how to fight for himself. Whatever happened tomorrow, he would face it as his own man, not as his father's puppet or a product of expectations. Matthew walked out of the bathroom, drying his hair with a towel. He looked at Seth, his eyes searching his face. "You're worried about him coming to the game, aren't you?" Matthew asked, sitting on the end of his own bed. Seth nodded slowly, looking down. "He said he'd be in the VIP box," Seth admitted. "He'll be watching every single move I make. If I slip up once, he'll be on the phone with the coach before the final whistle even blows." He felt the familiar weight of dread creeping back into his chest. Matthew stood up and walked over to Seth. He grabbed him by the chin, forcing him to look up. Then give him a show he'll never forget, Matthew said fiercely. Make him regret ever doubting you. Make him watch you become a legend on that field tomorrow. They turned out the lights, but neither of them could sleep. The excitement and the anxiety were too strong. They lay in their separate beds, listening to the sound of each other's breathing. The silence was filled with anticipation for the battle ahead. Seth, Matthew whispered into the darkness. Yeah, Seth replied, staring at the ceiling. I meant what I said, Matthew continued, his voice low and steady. I'm with you. We're on this together. No matter what the scoreboard says, we've already won. Seth smiled in the dark. He felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the fever he had survived weeks ago. I know, Seth whispered back. See you on the field, Matthew. He finally closed his eyes, drifting into a deep, dreamless, and peaceful sleep. The morning would bring the game of their lives. Thousands of fans, the pressure of a legacy, and the uncertainty of their future awaited them. But as the clock ticked closer to dawn, they were ready. The transformation was complete, and they were ready to roar. The sun rose over the campus with blinding intensity. Seth woke up before the alarm even sounded. He felt electric energy coursing through his veins. Beside him, Matthew was still asleep, looking surprisingly peaceful for such a lethal competitor. Seth sat up and stared at his uniform hanging on the door. Today was the day his entire life would be defined. He thought of his father, the VIP box, and the pressure that had nearly crushed him. Today, he wouldn't just play. He would conquer. He slipped out of bed and went to the window. The stadium lights were already being prepped. He could hear the faint sound of ground crews getting everything ready for the massive crowds. This was his stage. This was his moment to break the chains. Matthew stirred in his bed and groaned, pulling the blanket over his head. Too bright, he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. Seth laughed, a genuine, light sound that surprised even himself. The tension of the past weeks had vanished entirely. Wake up, rookie, Seth said, walking over to nudge Matthew's shoulder. We have a stadium to take over. Matthew peeked out from under the blanket, his eyes crinkling at the corners. For a brief second, they were just two young men starting a day. The stadium was a chaotic, beautiful mess of noise and color. The crowd was deafening. Seth stood in the tunnel, listening to the roar of 50,000 people. He adjusted his gloves and looked over at Matthew, who was doing the same. Remember the plan? Matthew asked, his face now a mask of pure, hardened focus. We play our game. Not my game. Not your game, our game. We control the tempo. We dictate the pace. We don't give them a single inch of breathing room. Seth nodded firmly. I remember. He reached out and bumped his fist against Matthew's armor-plated chest. It was a silent promise. They were a team. They were the backbone of the White Lions, and tonight they were going to prove it to the world. Coach walked down the tunnel, looking stressed. He stopped in front of them, his eyes darting between the two of them. You two are the focus today, he barked. If you fail, this team fails. If you lead, we win. Do you understand? We understand, Coach, they said in unison. Their voices were perfectly aligned. Coach nodded once, satisfied, and turned to lead the team out onto the field. The bright, blinding lights awaited them at the end of the tunnel. The game began with a violent collision on the kickoff. The White Lions came out swinging. Seth took the first snap and immediately felt the rhythm they had practiced. He rolled out, faked a pass, and found the receiver with a pinpoint throw. The crowd went wild. Seth felt his confidence soaring. He glanced up at the VIP box. His father was there, leaning over the railing, his face unreadable. Seth didn't look away. He stood tall, adjusted his helmet, and lined up for the next snap. Matthew was a monster on defense. He disrupted every single play the opposing team tried to run. He was everywhere, tackling, blocking, and leading the charge. When he intercepted a pass and ran it back for a touchdown, the stadium literally shook. They were in sync. Every pass Seth threw seemed to be predicted by Matthew's presence on the field. They were moving like two parts of a single machine. The offensive and defensive lines were feeding off their incredible, unstoppable energy. At halftime, they were leading by 3 scores. The locker room was ecstatic. Players were high-fiving and shouting, but Seth and Matthew stayed in the back, cooling down. They didn't need to celebrate yet. The job was only halfway done. During the third quarter, the opposition fought back. They adjusted their strategy and started putting intense pressure on Seth. He was sacked twice, and the crowd started to murmur. The pressure was mounting, and he could feel it in his bones. He saw his father stand up in the VIP box, his expression turning sour. The fear tried to creep back in, the fear of being a failure, the fear of losing it all. Seth closed his eyes for a split second, taking a deep, centering breath. "Ignore him," a voice whispered in his ear. It was Matthew, who had come over to the offensive side to give him some water. "He's just an old man in a box. Look at the field. Look at your team. We're winning, Seth. Don't you dare stop now." Seth opened his eyes and looked at Matthew. The rookie's intensity was a beacon in the storm. "I'm not stopping," Seth said firmly. "We're going to finish this." He grabbed the ball, stepped back into the huddle, and looked at his team with absolute conviction. He called the hardest play in their book. His teammates looked at him, surprised, but they didn't question him. They trusted him. Seth walked back to the line of scrimmage, his heart steady. He was ready to end this game once and for all. The fourth quarter was a brutal, physical battle. They were tied with 2 minutes left on the clock. It all came down to this final drive. Seth walked onto the field, his legs feeling heavy, his jersey torn, his body bruised. "One more," Matthew said, walking alongside him. "One more drive, and we make history." Seth nodded, his eyes scanning the defense. He saw the gaps. He saw the path. He knew exactly what he had to do to win the game. The stadium was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Seth took the snap. He dropped back, waiting for the defensive line to commit. They charged. He stepped into the pocket, dodging a tackle, and threw the ball. It was a long, soaring pass that hung in the air for an eternity. The receiver caught it in the corner of the end zone, just barely keeping his feet in bounds. The whistle blew. It was a touchdown. The stadium erupted in absolute madness. They had won. The White Lions had secured the victory. Seth stood on the field, breathless and covered in dirt, as his teammates rushed him. He looked up at the VIP box. His father was still there, looking down at him. But for the first time, he didn't care. The final whistle echoed through the stadium, marking the end of the game. The crowd's roar was a physical wave of sound. Seth stood in the middle of the chaos, feeling the sweat cool on his skin. He had done it. He had actually won. His teammates swarmed him, lifting him onto their shoulders in celebration. He saw the scoreboard flashing the final result, confirming the win. For the first time in his life, the adrenaline wasn't fueled by fear, but by pure, unadulterated joy. He looked for Matthew amidst the sea of jerseys. He found him on the sidelines, looking battered but grinning. Their eyes locked across the distance. In that moment, the entire world seemed to fade away. It was a silent acknowledgement of everything they had survived. He hopped down from his teammates' shoulders and pushed through the crowd. He didn't care about the reporters or the cameras. He reached Matthew, who was wiping mud from his face. They didn't speak. They just stood there, breathing hard and laughing. "We did it," Seth said, his voice cracking with emotion. Matthew grabbed him by the shoulder and pulled him into a rough, brotherly embrace. But it lingered, more intimate than intended, as they finally stood on the other side of the fire. The post-game interview was a blur of bright lights and shouted questions. Seth handled them with a poise he had never possessed before. He talked about team effort, strategy, and resilience, giving credit where it was due, including the rookie linebacker. He saw his father walking toward the locker room entrance. The VIP box was empty. Ted Winward looked older, smaller than Seth remembered. He stopped in front of his son, his expression guarded. The air between them felt thin and fragile. "You played well," his father said. His voice was stiff, lacking the usual sharp edge of command. "Your strategy was sound. You didn't choke under the pressure." It was the closest thing to a compliment Seth had ever received from him. Seth looked him straight in the eye. He didn't shrink away. He didn't seek his father's approval. "I played well because I stopped trying to be you," Seth replied calmly. "I played because I wanted to win for myself and for my team." His father stared at him for a long, uncomfortable moment. He seemed to be searching for the boy he could control, but he found a man he couldn't. He finally nodded once and turned to walk away. The power dynamic had shifted forever. Seth walked back into the locker room, feeling a sense of liberation. The weight that had been crushing his chest for years had finally vanished. He reached his locker and found Matthew waiting there, leaning against the bench. "That was quite the speech out there," Matthew teased, his grin returning. "You might actually have a future in politics if the football thing doesn't work out." Seth laughed and sat down, feeling the fatigue finally starting to set in. "I'm just glad it's over," Seth admitted. "I don't have to be the perfect son anymore. I can just be me." He looked at Matthew and realized that me now included the person sitting right in front of him. "So, what happens now, Captain?" Matthew asked softly. The locker room was clearing out, leaving them in the quiet, lingering scent of sweat and success. The rivalry was long dead, buried under the weight of the last 3 weeks of intense struggle. Seth leaned back against the locker, looking at the rookie. "Now," he repeated, "now I think we have a long off-season to figure out exactly what us is supposed to look like." He felt a smile tugging at his lips, genuinely happy for once. They left the stadium together as the moon rose high over the quiet campus. The streets were empty, the silence of the night a stark contrast to the roar of the game. They walked side by side, their shoulders brushing with every step. "You know," Matthew said, breaking the silence, "I really did want to take your spot at first. I wanted to see you fall because I thought you were just a fraud protected by a name." He looked at Seth with newfound respect. "I know," Seth replied, "and I hated you for it. I thought you were just another obstacle standing between me and my father's impossible standards." He stopped walking and turned to face Matthew. "But you weren't an obstacle," Seth continued. "You were the only person who actually pushed me to be better. You were the only one who didn't care about the legacy. You just cared about the game and me." Matthew stepped closer, his dark eyes searching Seth's face. "I care about you, Seth, more than I ever thought I would." He reached out and held Seth's hand. It felt natural, right, and completely terrifying. And for the first time, Seth didn't care. They reached their dorm, the place where everything had begun. They stood in the hallway for a moment, the weight of the day finally catching up to them. It had been a long, hard journey, but they had made it through the fire together. "Are you going to sleep in your own bed tonight?" Matthew asked, a playful glint in his eye. Seth didn't answer with words. He just walked into their shared room and sat on the edge of Matthew's bed, looking back at him. "I think I've grown accustomed to this bed," Seth admitted. He lay back against the pillows, closing his eyes. He felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in his entire life. The pressure was gone, the future was uncertain, but he was exactly where he wanted to be. Matthew followed him, closing the door behind him. He didn't ask again. He just lay down beside Seth, their bodies fitting together as if they were always meant to. In the quiet dark of the room, there were no rivals, no captains, no fathers. There was only the two of them. They had gambled everything and won the only thing that mattered. As they drifted off to sleep, Seth realized that the game wasn't about the championship or the draft. It was about finding the one person who made the fight worth it. The season was just beginning, and he couldn't wait to play the rest of his life with Matthew by his side. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting long, soft shadows across the room. Seth woke up slowly, his body feeling heavy but strangely relaxed. He didn't jump up in a panic. He didn't worry about practice schedules or his father. He turned his head to see Matthew still sound asleep beside him. The rookie looked different without the mask of competition. He looked younger, softer, and more at peace than Seth had ever seen him. The intensity of their rivalry felt like a distant, faded memory. Seth lay there for a long time, just watching the steady rise and fall of Matthew's chest. He thought about the journey that had brought them to this bed. It was a path of anger, resentment, and finally, a profound, unexpected connection. He realized that he had spent his entire life waiting for something that would never come. He had been waiting for his father's approval, but he found something much better instead. He had found someone who accepted him for exactly who he was. Matthew stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He blinked against the sunlight, then shifted until he was facing Seth. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face. It wasn't a smirk or a challenge. It was just a smile of content. "Good morning, Captain," Matthew whispered, his voice raspy with sleep. Seth smiled back, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. "Good morning, Matthew," he replied. For the first time, he didn't need a title. Life outside their dorm room went on as usual. The campus was back to its normal rhythm, with students rushing to classes and the team preparing for the next set of games. But for Seth and Matthew, the world felt fundamentally different. They walked to breakfast together, not caring who saw them or what people whispered. They had faced the fire and come out on the other side. The rumors didn't matter. The judgment of others didn't have the power to touch them anymore. They realized that their dynamic had become the talk of the team. Some players were confused, others were suspicious, but most were just relieved that the tension had ended. The White Lions were a stronger unit than they had been before. Seth found that his leadership was more natural now. He wasn't leading out of fear or obligation to a legacy. He was leading because he truly cared about his teammates and the success of the group. He was finally, truly, the captain. Matthew, too, had changed. He wasn't the arrogant rookie trying to prove his dominance. He was a dedicated teammate who had found his place. He and Seth worked together, not as rivals, but as a duo that no other team could stop. As the weeks passed, they navigated the challenges of their new reality. There were still difficult days, and the pressure of the upcoming draft was always present. But they had each other, and that made all the difference in the world. Seth still kept in touch with his father, but the dynamic was forever altered. He stood his ground on his own terms. He didn't ask for permission, and he didn't apologize for his life. It was a work in progress, but it was healthy. They spent their nights in the dorm, talking about their dreams, their fears, and the future. They planned their next moves, not just as football players, but as people who were building a life together. It was a journey that was just beginning. They discovered that they had much more in common than they ever imagined. They shared a passion for the game, a drive to be the best, and a deep underlying need for connection. They were a perfect match in ways they never expected. In the end, they learned that the greatest rivalry of their lives hadn't been an enemy at all. It had been the bridge to everything they truly wanted. They had played the game, they had won, and they had found something lasting. The season concluded with a championship victory, a testament to the partnership that had started in a shower and ended on the field. They walked off the final turf as legends, but more importantly, they walked off as themselves. They had navigated the highs and lows, the threats and the triumphs. They had grown from enemies to partners, from rivals to lovers, and from boys to men. It was a story of redemption, passion, and the power of standing your ground. As they looked toward the future, they knew that there would be more battles to fight. The world would present new challenges, and their path would not always be easy, but they were ready to face it all, side by side, forever. They returned to their dorm one last time, the space that had witnessed their most intense moments. It felt like home. They looked at each other, knowing that they had achieved the only thing that truly mattered. They had won their own lives, and as they closed the door on the past, they opened it to a future that was entirely their own. They were the captain and the rookie, the rivals and the partners. They were the champions of their own very remarkable love story. The college campus began to quiet down as the long, intense semester drew to a close. Leaves turned golden, then brown, and the air grew sharp with the bite of winter. For Seth and Matthew, the transition was bittersweet but deeply rewarding. They were no longer the hot topic of locker room gossip. Their partnership on the field had become legendary, a standard by which all other teammates measured themselves. The mystery of their bond had evolved into a quiet, unwavering mutual respect. Seth often found himself reflecting on the man he used to be. The constant anxiety, the obsession with the draft, the suffocating shadow of his father, it all felt like a story about someone else. He had shed that skin completely. He spent his evenings in the library, focusing on his academics with the same intensity he brought to the game. He wasn't just playing for the NFL draft anymore. He was building a life that he actually wanted to inhabit. Matthew, meanwhile, had blossomed into a natural leader. The arrogance had been replaced by a fierce, protective loyalty to the team. He and Seth were inseparable, their lives intertwined in a way that felt both natural and entirely essential. One afternoon, a thick, heavy envelope arrived in the mail. It bore the return address of the Windward family estate. Seth stared at it for a long time, his pulse steady and calm. He finally opened it with a letter opener. It was a letter from his father. It wasn't the usual list of demands or criticisms. It was a brief, surprisingly humble acknowledgement of the season's success. Ted Windward had watched the final games from afar and felt a grudging pride. "You have found your own way," the letter read. "I may not understand it, but I respect the strength it took to forge it." It was not a grand apology, but for Seth, it was enough. He folded the letter and put it away. He didn't need his father's validation anymore. He realized that the hunger for that approval had been the true opponent he had to defeat. The game against his father was over, and he had won simply by walking away from the fight. He shared the contents of the letter with Matthew later that night. Matthew read it, then looked at Seth with a small, proud smile. "He's starting to see you as a man," Matthew noted. "You've already won, Seth. You don't need his permission anymore." The off-season provided them with the time to explore who they were outside of the football bubble. They took trips to the coast, spent quiet weekends in the city, and finally started to exist as a couple in the real world. They found that they enjoyed the simple things: morning coffee, late-night movies, and long walks where they didn't have to talk about playbooks or coverage patterns. It was a freedom they had never anticipated. There was a profound peace in realizing that they didn't have to perform for anyone. They could just be themselves, clumsy and human and happy. It was a stark contrast to the high-stakes pressure they had lived under for so long. "Do you ever miss it?" Matthew asked one evening, watching the sunset over the horizon. "The intensity? The constant grind of being someone else?" Seth looked at him and shook his head without a second of hesitation. "I miss the game," Seth admitted, "but I don't miss the cage. I was living in a cage, Matthew. You were the one who gave me the key." He squeezed Matthew's hand, feeling the strength in his grip. As the new year approached, they began to make plans for what lay ahead. The draft was looming, and it would bring new challenges, new cities, and new teammates. But they looked at the uncertainty with excitement rather than fear. They knew their paths might take them to different teams, or perhaps even the same one. It didn't matter. The foundation they had built was strong enough to survive whatever distance the professional league placed between them. They had learned that their connection wasn't bound by proximity or sport. It was built on the shared history of their survival and the choice to love each other through the messiest parts of their lives. They returned to their dorm room, which was now filled with memories of the last few months. It wasn't just a place where they had been forced to share space. It was the birthplace of their entire future. They stood in the center of the room, looking at the life they had crafted from nothing. They were ready for whatever was coming next. They were no longer just the captain and the rookie. They were something entirely new. Seth sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the game ball sitting on the dresser. It was the ball from their final victory. It represented everything they had fought for and everything they had overcome to get there. He reached out and touched the worn leather. He didn't see a tool of the trade. He saw a symbol of their victory over expectations. He turned to look at Matthew, who was watching him with a look of pure devotion. "We did it," Seth whispered. "We survived." Matthew moved to sit beside him, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. "We did more than survive, Seth," he replied. "We lived, and we're just getting started." The room was quiet, filled with the promise of the coming morning. They had played their hearts out, fought their own wars, and found the only victory that lasted. They were finally at peace, and they were finally together. As the last echoes of the past faded away, the future stood before them, bright and unwritten. They had rewritten the story, and it was a masterpiece. The whistle had blown on their old lives, and the game of their future was ready to begin.